Ethan Walker learned the weight of silence on the morning his father was sentenced. The courtroom was full, yet everything meaningful happened in the pauses between words, in the stillness that followed Judge Margaret Holloway's measured voice. She did not raise it when she read the ruling. She did not look at Robert Walker when the sentence concluded. The gavel fell once, clean and final, and a life splintered into before and after. Ethan stood beside his mother, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles ached. He had prepared himself for disappointment, even for injustice, but not for the calm efficiency with which it arrived. Margaret Holloway was 62, composed, respected, her silver hair immaculate beneath the courtroom lights. To Ethan, she looked untouchable, a symbol of a system that moved forward without hesitation or memory. Robert Walker turned only once as marshals led him away. His eyes found Ethan's, steady and apologetic, as if he were the one at fault for failing to protect his son from this moment. Ethan nodded, swallowing the words he could not speak. Then his father was gone, absorbed by procedure. Outside the courthouse, the city moved on. Cars passed. People laughed into phones. Ethan felt suspended, as though the world had tilted and failed to right itself. His mother spoke little in the days that followed, retreating into routines that required no conversation. Ethan filled out paperwork, answered calls, and learned how quickly support thinned once the spectacle ended. Tonight, he replayed the sentencing. Not the evidence, not the arguments, but the judge's face. He searched it for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that suggested the decision had cost her something. He found nothing, and that absence hardened into resentment. Months passed. Letters from his father arrived weekly, written in careful handwriting that avoided despair. Robert urged Ethan to continue his studies, to trust the law even when it failed. Ethan read the letters twice each time, moved by the optimism he did not share. The email arrived on an ordinary afternoon, its subject line unremarkable. A research fellowship, judicial policy, full funding. Ethan read it once with interest, then again as the name attached to his placement registered. Judge Margaret Holloway, that he closed his laptop and stared at the wall. Declining would be easy. Accepting would require a discipline he was not sure he possessed. But practicality won. Rent, tuition, and a future he owed himself outweighed pride. He replied with a brief acceptance, his fingers steady despite the decision's implications. Their first meeting took place in chambers rather than court. The room surprised him. It was smaller than he expected, warmer, lined with books rather than authority. Margaret Holloway stood when he entered, extending a hand he did not take immediately. The moment stretched, then resolved into a polite handshake. "Mr. Walker," she said, "please sit." They spoke of schedules and expectations. Her questions were precise, her tone neutral. Ethan answered efficiently, careful to offer nothing personal. He noticed the faint fatigue in her eyes, the controlled posture that suggested a lifetime of restraint. She did not mention his father. Neither did he. When the meeting ended, Margaret paused. "I am aware of your circumstances," she said. "If at any point this arrangement proves untenable, you may say so." Ethan met her gaze. "I'm here to work." She nodded, accepting the boundary. "So am I." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Ethan reviewed cases, compiled data, traced patterns that mirrored his own loss with uncomfortable accuracy. Margaret reviewed his work with rigor, challenging assumptions and pressing for clarity. She did not soften criticism, and Ethan did not ask her to. Respect grew, reluctant and restrained. Still, the past hovered. Ethan caught himself listening for echoes of the courtroom in her voice, finding instead a quieter determination. Margaret, for her part, observed Ethan's diligence, the way grief had sharpened his focus rather than dulled it. She admired his restraint without naming it point one evening. As the courthouse emptied and rain streaked the windows, Margaret stopped by Ethan's office. "You should go home," she said. "In a minute," he replied, eyes still on the screen. She hesitated, then stepped inside. "May I?" He nodded, and they reviewed his latest analysis together. The conversation shifted from statistics to intent, from outcomes to consequence. Margaret spoke of the burden of certainty. Ethan spoke of living with its aftermath. Neither raised their voice. Neither looked away. When they finished, the rain had eased. Margaret gathered her things, then paused. "This work matters," she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan watched her leave, unsettled by the realization that the woman he had cast as an antagonist was more complicated than his anger allowed. As he shut down his computer, he understood that accepting the fellowship had not merely reopened a wound. It had placed him at the edge of a story he did not yet understand, one that would demand more from him than endurance alone. Ethan Walker did not plan to see Judge Margaret Holloway again, not outside the courtroom, and certainly not in a context that required conversation. Yet fate, indifferent to his preferences, placed her name on the top of the acceptance email that arrived 3 months after his father's sentencing. The Judicial Policy Research Fellowship congratulated him with sterile enthusiasm and informed him that he would be working directly with a senior federal judge on sentencing reform. He read the email twice before his stomach tightened. Margaret Holloway he considered declining. Pride urged him to walk away, to refuse any proximity to the woman whose voice still echoed in his memory, measured and final. But rent was due, his scholarship was fragile, and his father's letters from prison carried an unspoken pressure to survive, to move forward. Ethan accepted the fellowship without celebration, telling himself that proximity did not equal forgiveness. Their first meeting took place in chambers that felt nothing like the courtroom. There was no elevated bench, no gavel, no audience. The room was lined with books instead of faces, the air faintly scented with old paper and black coffee. Margaret Holloway sat behind a modest desk, her silver hair pinned neatly, her posture composed but not rigid. She looked up when Ethan entered, recognition flickering across her expression before settling into professional calm. "Mr. Walker," she said, standing. "Thank you for coming." Her voice was the same, but the power it carried felt altered in this smaller space. Ethan nodded, refusing to offer more. He noticed the lines at the corners of her eyes, the careful restraint in her movements. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee. They began with logistics. Research hours, confidentiality, objectives. Margaret spoke clearly, efficiently, never lingering. Ethan answered when necessary, his responses clipped but respectful. Neither mentioned the courtroom. The silence around it grew dense, pressing against every sentence that it was Margaret who finally acknowledged it, not with apology, but with honesty. "I am aware," she said, folding her hands, "that my presence may be difficult for you." Ethan met her gaze for the first time. "You sentenced my father." "Yes," she replied. No justification followed, no defense. Just the truth, placed carefully between them. "I'm here to work," Ethan said after a moment. "That's all." Margaret inclined her head. "Then we understand each other." Over the following weeks, their interactions remained formal, almost austere. Ethan worked from a small office down the hall, buried in case law and data, charting disparities that mirrored his own life with uncomfortable precision. Margaret reviewed his drafts with sharp attention, offering critiques that were demanding but fair. She never softened her language for him, and he came to respect her for that, even as resentment simmered beneath the surface. Outside the chambers, Ethan's life remained sparse. His mother had retreated into a quiet distance after the trial, grief hardening into routine. His father's letters arrived every Friday, carefully optimistic, filled with concern for Ethan's future rather than his own present. Claire Benson, his oldest friend, met him for coffee when she could, her concern steady and unintrusive. She listened more than she spoke, which Ethan appreciated. Margaret's life, though largely invisible to Ethan at first, revealed itself in fragments. A phone call she ended too quickly when he entered the room. A faint tension in her shoulders late in the evening. Once, he overheard her speaking to her husband, Daniel Holloway, her voice polite and distant, as though addressing a colleague rather than a partner of decades. When she noticed Ethan nearby, she ended the call without explanation. The shift between them began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, as rain streaked the windows and the courthouse emptied, Ethan stayed late to finish a report. Margaret emerged from her office carrying her coat, then paused when she saw his lights still on. "You'll burn out if you keep these hours," she said, not unkindly. "So will the system," Ethan replied before he could stop himself. Margaret studied him, something thoughtful passing through her expression. She set her coat aside and asked to see the report. They sat across from each other, reviewing data that exposed patterns neither could ignore. For the first time, their conversation drifted beyond assignments into belief. Justice, they discovered, meant something personal to both of them, though for different reasons. Margaret spoke of the weight of decisions, of sentences that followed her home in the quiet hours. Ethan spoke of watching a family fracture under the force of one ruling. The air between them shifted, not with warmth, but with recognition. Neither smiled. From that night on, their conversations grew longer, more reflective. They did not discuss the past directly, but it hovered nearby, shaping every exchange. Ethan noticed that Margaret listened with an intensity that bordered on hunger, as though his perspective offered something missing in her life. Margaret noticed that Ethan challenged her without disrespect, his intelligence sharpened by loss. Still, boundaries remained intact. They met in public spaces. Doors stayed open. Words were chosen carefully. Yet something unspoken began to form, a fragile understanding neither of them named. The tension crystallized one afternoon when Ethan submitted a proposal questioning mandatory minimums. Margaret read it in silence, then removed her glasses. "This would require judges to admit we're not infallible," she said. "Are we?" Ethan asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "We are not." That admission changed everything. Ethan left Chambers that evening with a restless awareness he could not explain. Margaret remained behind, staring at the closed door longer than necessary. Outside, the courthouse lights dimmed, and both of them sensed, with equal clarity and unease, that the path ahead was no longer purely professional. The work would continue, but so would the questions, and neither yet understood the cost of seeking their answers together. The change did not announce itself with a single moment. It unfolded gradually, like a fault line widening beneath ordinary days. Ethan Walker began to notice that Judge Margaret Holloway remembered details she did not need to remember. The author he cited most often, the neighborhood where he grew up, the way he took his coffee when deadlines stretched late. None of it crossed a line, yet each small attentiveness accumulated weight. Their conversations extended beyond policy. They spoke about intention and consequence, about the spaces where law failed to account for mercy. Margaret admitted, once, that she still heard the cadence of certain sentences long after they were delivered, as if the courtroom had followed her home. Ethan told her how his father counted time by letters, how optimism became an act of discipline inside prison walls. These exchanges were measured, careful, but they carried an intimacy born of shared confession. Late evenings became common. The courthouse thinned to a hush, custodial carts rattling faintly down marble corridors. Margaret would suggest reviewing one more draft, and Ethan would agree, neither of them questioning why the work felt easier together. They sat across from each other, sleeves rolled, the lamp casting a circle of light that seemed to separate them from the rest of the building of the tea home. Margaret's marriage continued in parallel silence. Daniel Holloway's messages were efficient, logistical. Dinner plans rescheduled. A charity event confirmed. When they spoke, their words slid past each other, polished and distant. Margaret found herself withholding the thoughts she shared with Ethan, not out of deceit, but because the effort to explain them to Daniel felt exhausting. She noticed the shift and did not correct it. Ethan sensed it too, though he lacked the language to name it. He told Claire Benson, over coffee, that the work felt heavier lately. Claire studied him with concern sharpened by familiarity. "Heavier how?" she asked. "Closer," Ethan said after a pause. "Too close." Claire did not smile. "You know what that means." "I know what it doesn't mean," he replied. "Nothing has happened." That's not always the point, she said gently. Back in chambers, a moment arrived that tested their restraint. Ethan presented an analysis demonstrating how discretionary bias affected outcomes across decades. Margaret read it in silence, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she closed the folder and leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "This challenges the foundation of my career," she said. Ethan braced himself. "Then it matters." She looked at him then, not as a judge assessing an argument, but as a woman confronting a reckoning. "You don't make it easy to stay comfortable," she said. "I'm not here for comfort," he replied. The honesty between them sharpened, stripping away pretense. Margaret began to share doubts she had never voiced aloud. Ethan began to feel that his presence offered her something she had been missing, a mirror unclouded by expectation. The realization unsettled him. Even as it drew him in, they set boundaries aloud, as if naming them would make them stronger. No private meetings outside the courthouse. No personal messages. No conversations that could not be defended as professional. The rules helped until they didn't. Emotions slipped through the cracks. Quiet and persistent. One evening, Margaret received a call from Daniel while Ethan was packing his bag. She answered, her tone composed, but Ethan heard the strain beneath it. Daniel spoke of obligations, of appearances. Margaret responded with agreement that sounded rehearsed. When the call ended, she did not move for several seconds. "I should go," Ethan said. She nodded, then surprised them both by saying, "Stay." Just for a moment. They did not speak. The silence held more than words could manage. Ethan stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on, feeling the gravity of the choice he was making simply by remaining. Margaret folded her hands, steadying herself, aware that what bound them now was not action but attention. "I think about your father," she said quietly. "More than I should." Ethan turned. "Why?" "Because he reminds me that sentences don't end when the hearing does," she replied. They echo. The admission landed between them, heavy and sincere. Ethan felt anger stir, then soften into something complicated. "I don't want pity," he said. "I know," Margaret replied. "That's not what this is." When Ethan finally left, the night air felt colder than it should have. He walked home, replaying every word, aware that a line had been crossed without either of them stepping over it. Margaret remained alone in her office, the lamp still on, considering the quiet damage of her own candor. The following days carried a tautness neither could ignore. Their work continued, precise and productive, yet charged with restraint. Each glance held a question they refused to ask. Each conversation ended a beat too soon. Ethan received a letter from his father that week, hopeful in tone, urging him to keep believing in the system. Ethan folded the letter carefully, struck by the irony, and wondered whether belief was an act of faith or defiance. Margaret, meanwhile, drafted a speech on judicial integrity she knew she could deliver flawlessly. What unsettled her was not the words, but the awareness that integrity demanded more than public adherence. It demanded private courage. When they next met, neither acknowledged the tension outright. Yet as they parted, Margaret said, almost to herself, "Some understandings cost more than ignorance." Ethan paused at the door. "Some truths do too," he replied. They held each other's gaze, knowing that what bound them now was not forbidden action, but a loyalty of thought that had quietly shifted. Both understood, with growing clarity, that continuing as they were would require a reckoning neither was ready to face, and that stopping might cost them something just as profound. The reckoning arrived without spectacle. It came in the form of an envelope placed quietly on Judge Margaret Holloway's desk, its contents routine by appearance, yet devastating in implication. A request for post-conviction review, newly filed, citing emerging evidence and sentencing disparities. Robert Walker's name sat at the center of the page, printed in unremarkable ink. Margaret read the filing twice, then a third time, her pulse steady but her thoughts unmoored. She recognized the merits immediately. The legal grounds were sound. The timing, however, was unforgiving. Any action she took would be scrutinized through the lens of her proximity to Ethan Walker, regardless of restraint or intention. She summoned Ethan that afternoon, her voice controlled, professional. When he arrived, she handed him the file without comment. He read in silence, his hands betraying him with a slight tremor. "This isn't because of me," he said finally, not a question but a plea. "No," Margaret replied. "It can't be." They discussed the process with careful precision. Recusal, independent review, transparency. Each word was chosen to protect the integrity of the outcome and the fragile boundary between them. Ethan listened, relief and disappointment colliding in equal measure. Justice, if it came, would arrive stripped of any personal triumph. That evening, Margaret returned home earlier than usual. Daniel Holloway was in the study, reviewing briefs, his attention divided between screens. She stood in the doorway longer than necessary before speaking. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up, surprised by the weight in her voice. She did not speak of Ethan by name, nor of feelings she could not defend. She spoke instead of distance, of conversations that had replaced connection, of an emotional fidelity she had allowed to drift elsewhere. Daniel listened, his expression hardening not with anger but with recognition. "We've been living parallel lives," he said quietly. "Yes," Margaret replied, "and that is my responsibility to acknowledge." They did not argue. There were no raised voices, no accusations. The decision unfolded with the same restraint that had defined their marriage's latter years. Separation would be discreet, dignified, public explanations minimal. When Daniel left the room, Margaret felt grief, but also a clarifying stillness. Ethan learned of the recusal the next day. Margaret informed him formally, her tone unchanged, though her eyes lingered on his face as if memorizing it. He thanked her, meaning more than the words conveyed. When he left Chambers, he understood that this goodbye was not symbolic. It was real. Weeks passed. The independent panel reviewed Robert Walker's case. The outcome, when it arrived, was modest but meaningful. A sentence reduction, a recognition of excess. Ethan read the notice in his small apartment, his father's voice echoing in his memory, steady and hopeful. He allowed himself a single, quiet moment of gratitude, directed not at Margaret, but at the system when it worked as it should. Ethan visited his father soon after. They spoke through glass, hands aligned but never touching. Robert smiled when Ethan shared the news, pride overtaking exhaustion. "You did something good," he said. "I learned from watching you survive," Ethan replied. Margaret watched the outcome from a distance, refusing any private satisfaction. She delivered her speech on judicial integrity the following month, her words resonant with lived understanding. Those who listened heard conviction. Only she knew the cost behind it, that on Ethan's final day with the fellowship, they met once more in Chambers. The room felt unchanged, yet everything between them had shifted. They spoke of logistics, of future plans. Ethan mentioned a position he had accepted across the country. Margaret wished him well, her voice steadied. "The door." Ethan paused. "What we understood," he said carefully, "it mattered to me." "It mattered to me too," Margaret replied, "which is why it must end here." He nodded, accepting the truth without bitterness. There was no embrace, no lingering touch, just a shared acknowledgement of something real that would remain unclaimed. As Ethan stepped into the hallway, the courthouse lights dimmed behind him. Margaret returned to her desk, the gavel resting untouched nearby. Both carried forward altered, not by scandal or surrender, but by the quiet discipline of choosing what was right over what was easy. The story between them did not conclude with possession, but with a clarity that would follow them long after they parted, shaping who they became next.